all know people like this. We know people that are very haphazard in their life. You go into their house is a wreck. There's no way in the world that you can be satisfied in living in a home that's a total wreck and then go to work and be totally organized to do your work. We just don't have a switch where we can turn things on and turn things off. And so what I saw in the devotion was that God is telling us in our ordinary life, we should prepare ourselves to do things as best we can. When we go to our job, we should do our job as best as we can. We ought not to settle for doing something half-hearted on our job. And what we see is that we will find that as time goes on, that just encompasses, good morning, that encompasses our entire life, okay? So little things, our job carries over to doing bigger things when we have tasks to do for God. And we just don't separate it. And likewise, we see people that are, happy Sabbath to you. We see people that are organized in their, good morning. We see people that are organized in their approach to their life, to their work, and then when they get to church, we see that they're organized as well. Our devotion just reads, and he's getting this set up because I think we're going to try to put it up on YouTube today, so we'll give him 2 minutes to do that. But what we're doing now is he's taping these Sabbath school classes and putting them on YouTube, so those people who are shut in, they'll have access to the lesson. You going to put this up on YouTube?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll wait 2 minutes while you get that set up, and then we'll go ahead and open the lesson if that's good for you.
Oh, this is already going.
It's already on? Okay,
Yeah.
good. So again, that's how it came to me. When God can trust us in small things, He'll trust us in big things. And so it's a continuation, it's a pattern of growth in our life that carries over, but it basically encompasses our entire life.
I agree, because all the scriptures that were chosen address the four the four elements of who we are, you know, in our mindset, where we think, right? And then in the garden,
right?
And then it talks about being like idle or in other people's business. So that's totality of who we are. And because we move and have our being because of Christ, you know, then if we realize that's where we get it from, then we'll be mindful of how we govern ourselves in any situation. So I agree with your question.
Absolutely. So I think that there's a carryover there, and we should, and so we prepare ourselves.
They say integrity is who you are when no one's looking.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
So you think about this,
Right.
all into God, who you are when only God and you are looking.
And I want you to hold that point. I want you to put a pin in that point, because we're going to come back to that in about 5 minutes. Okay? That's a very, very good point that you made today. Okay? Any other thoughts on the devotion? So it's preparation, approach everything with our full heart, approach it as if though we're doing it for God, not for men. And that's exactly the mindset that Ezra and Nehemiah and Haggai had when they did their, when they were doing what God had given them to do. Okay? All right. Everybody has their, the second page is just a little handout, very quickly. And basically on our handout, basically what I have here is I put together just a short synopsis of where are we in lesson number 4 in the quarter of Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay? Are we all there?
You said on page 2?
That's the handout, page 1. It's page 1 at the top. I'm not going to read. I'm not going to read the whole handout. But where we are now is that in lesson number 4, the Jews have been unfaithful, and we know that the Jews were disobedient for some 1,500 years, from Abraham through Babylon. There were periods of time where they were very disobedient. The Jews are taken to Babylon, and they're held captive for 70 years. And we have studied that timeline in lesson 1, from Babylon to Nebuchadnezzar II, to Cyrus, Darius, onward to Artaxerxes I. God moved the hearts of 3 pagan kings, Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes I. All wrote decrees to allow the Jews to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, and to rebuild the wall and gates around the city. So this week, we studied the opposition that the Jews faced in their rebuilding effort. As I said a moment ago, today's lesson is really like a part one of part two, because part one is their opposition from outside of their community. Next week, we're going to be looking at the opposition that the Jews faced within their community from Nehemiah chapter 5. So one outside, next week within their community. So we see here, going on, in this week in lesson 4, facing opposition, we're going to look at the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. We're going to look at the book of Haggai, who was the main prophet to Ezra. And then we're going to look at Zechariah, who was the main prophet to Zerubbabel and to Nehemiah. Our study this week focuses on Ezra 4 and 5, and that focuses on the opposition to Zerubbabel to constructing the temple in Jerusalem. Nehemiah 4 and 6 focuses on the opposition to Nehemiah to constructing the wall and the gates around Jerusalem. And then Haggai chapter 1, which is in 519 BC, he called the people of God to reverence and to glorify God by building the temple in spite of local and official opposition. So we see that our lesson this week really contains several aspects of opposition that the Jews faced in building the temple, Jerusalem, okay, and then Haggai, who was called to prophesy and tell them that the temple should be built again in spite of the opposition that they were going to face. Good morning, Rick.
Good morning.
How are you? Happy Sabbath. Good to see you. We're on the second page here. We're already done with the brochure. So we're just kind of encapsulating where we're going. Again, before we, in number 3 actually, it says this week we look at the opposition that Zerubbabel and Nehemiah faced in trying to complete their divine assignments. And really this is a blueprint for when we run into opposition to a calling from God. We know that Zerubbabel and Nehemiah both had the heart of God. We discussed that last week. And so they were faithful, they gave thanks, they were humble, and they were contrite, and they repented. And they were only going to rely on God for guidance to complete their task. And that's something that we took away from last week as well. Is that correct? So Ezra, the book of Ezra, verses 1 through 6, that deals with Zerubbabel building the temple. If we turn over, Zechariah, in his prophecy in chapter 4, verse 6, he tells Zerubbabel that God said that the temple will be completed by my spirit alone, not by strength or by might, which was taken from our devotion from week number 1. Okay? And then Ezra 7 to 10 basically deals with the second group of exiles to go back to Jerusalem with Ezra in 457 BC. And then we finish out, you can read this. I don't want to take too much time with reading this. But in summary, where it says in the blue there, it says that the first decree was given in 538 by Cyrus to go back to start the work on the temple. Essentially, the work went on for 2 years, from 536 to 534, and then the work was halted by opposition, and it was stopped. It was stopped officially by Artaxerxes in 522. The work resumed, and good morning, how are you? And in 519 by Darius until the temple was completed in 515. So what this says is that it took 23 years to complete the temple, but the actual work time on completing the temple was just 6 years. They had 16, 17 years of opposition to building the temple. And by contrast, it took Solomon just 13 years to build the previous temple. And we understand that that temple was much bigger, much more glamorous. And actually, the people who were rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem were kind of upset that this temple was going to be smaller and not on the size that Solomon had built that temple
And
when
it
he
took
built his.
Solomon how many years?
It took him 13 years to build his temple. And it took them 23 years. That's the
Oh,
last
yeah,
version.
okay. But are you including the time period that they were told to stop?
Yes, right. The time period that they had the opposition. So that shows just how significant the opposition was that they were facing. Okay? And so then we'll finish out with Zechariah 5, chapter 5, and Ezra chapter 5, chapters 1 and 2, and Ezra 5, 3 through 17. And then Nehemiah, at the end, he deals with the opposition to the construction of the gates and the wall. And we'll get into all of that as we then go through our class, okay? Any questions about that, how we set it up? So we've gotten, so far they've been released, now they've been released, now they're gonna go back and do the work. Now we're going to be, now we're gonna look at the opposition. Before we go any further, I want to just take a quick break, because last week we were talking about the 2300 year and 490 year prophecy last week, and we kind of ran out of time last week to explain that, and then there were some questions about that. Would we prefer to go into that now, do the lesson, and then come back to that at the end? What would be better for people?
Review it now.
Do it now?
Yeah.
Let's do it right now. Anybody have our handout from last week? Okay, we'll take a pause for 5 minutes, and we'll explain this. Let's see here. Yes, I think I have some more of them. Let's see. I do. Here we go. I got some. Just yeah, just you got yours from last week? You got one from last week?
Right.
Mm-hmm. You got one, sir?
It's in the car.
Yes, no problem. Yes. Right. Everybody got one? Okay. That's just the graph that we gave there. Okay. All right. And Rita, we started before you got here. You're normally the first one here.
Yeah.
But that was number one on my list to tell you that I enjoyed your teaching last week. I enjoyed the class, and I enjoyed sitting right there listening and participating. So we enjoyed that, and your leadership was much appreciated, okay? And it's always good to tell somebody, listen, I enjoyed that, while they can hear it, right? So they know that they enjoy what you're doing, right?
I said it at home to him, but I forgot.
Give me my flowers right here.
Well, we're
You're on YouTube.
we're gonna tell you we can appreciate that. Let's take 5 minutes just to take a look at this very quickly. The issue becomes in the 2300 year and the 490 year prophecy. We have this paper here. What's the significance of that? And Tiandra asked us last week, can somebody tell me in a sentence or two what's the significance of these two prophecies? Okay? The two prophecies are located in Daniel 8 and Daniel 9. Okay? In Daniel chapter 8, and I'm not going to go too far into the explanation of this, but in Daniel 8, Daniel has a vision where he sees a goat with 2 horns, a ram with 1 horn. Let me double check and make sure that I have that exactly right. He sees a ram with 2 horns, and he sees a goat with 1 horn. And then after that, he sees one of the horns from that goat really blossoms into a very big horn. The explanation of that period of time where there's a lot of tribulation is that God is talking to him about the Medo-Persian Empire, which is going to end because the Greek Empire, Alexander the Great, is going to take over, is going to end that empire. The Greek Empire ends when Alexander the Great dies, and it gets divided up. It's not conquered. And so one of the horns that comes out of that is reference to the Third Empire, which is the Roman Empire. Okay? So during this vision, there's a lot of activity. There's a lot of fighting, that sort of thing going on in the vision. But at the end, Daniel says, well, how long is this period of time going to go forward? And it says 2,300 years that this is going to go on. And then what's going to happen is the temple is going to be reconsecrated again. Are we good where we are right now?
So you're saying that Daniel sees a vision.
Right.
He sees 1 horn, he sees 2 horns.
Right. Gabriel comes to him, and then Gabriel explains the vision to him. Okay? Right. Okay? And so Gabriel tells him that he explains the vision, and then what he says is that Daniel says, well, how long is this going to go on? It's going to go for a long period of time. It's going to go on for 2,300 years. Seal the vision up for right now because apparently it's not that important right now. That's Daniel chapter 8. Okay? In Daniel chapter 9, And it's really interesting because between chapter 8 and chapter 9, there is a period of, there's a period of about 38 years that goes on between Daniel 8 and Daniel 9, okay? And in Daniel number 9, in chapter 9, what happens is that Gabriel then explains to Daniel, not through another vision, but Daniel recognizes this is from Gabriel from a previous vision. He comes to him and he explains to him that there's a 490-year prophecy. And what he says is that the 490-year prophecy is going to be cut out of the 2300-year prophecy. So what that says is that, and then Gabriel tells him that the starting point of these two prophecies is going to be 457 BC, because that's going to be the year that the decree is given to reconstruct Jerusalem. That's 457 BC. So both of them are taken, or start at the year 457 BC, which might be correct here.
So you're saying
Both prophecies start at 457 BC. Now, there's a lot of numbers in Daniel 9, but essentially what the prophecy says that there's going to be a 490-year period going forward from 457 that also starts the 2300-year prophecy that we have. The significance of the 490-year prophecy is that it tells us that in the year 483, the 483rd year of that prophecy is that the Anointed One is going to start his ministry. That's Jesus Christ. So the 490-year prophecy tells us exactly to the year when Jesus Christ, when his ministry will start here on the earth. And that's in the year 27 AD, okay? It also tells us that Christ is going to be cut off, and we know that Christ had his ministry lasted 3.5 years, so in the year 31 AD, he's going to be cut off 3.5 years later. And then 3.5 years later after that, which completes the 490-year prophecy, that is when the message goes to Jew and Gentile that the salvation is open to both. Why? Because the 490-year prophecy was constructed on the fact that God was going to give the Jews 490 years to get right with him. If they did not, at the end of that 490-year prophecy, then salvation would be open to both Jew and Gentile. The Jews didn't comply, and so at the end of the 490-year prophecy, with the stoning of Stephen, then now the message goes to Jew and Gentile for salvation. So that's the significance of the 490-year prophecy. One is it tells us the exact year that Christ will start his ministry here on earth, and two, when he will be cut off, and three, when Jew and Gentile both would be open to salvation. Okay? Now, question.
You stated that God told them that if they didn't get it right, okay, then salvation would be open to the Jews as well as the Gentiles.
Yes.
That sounds like God had a contingency there. If the Jews had, then would the Gentiles have been left out?
So the Jews were the chosen people, so.
I understand that. Yeah. Wow.
That raises a good point. And there's nothing that I have read in the Bible that makes accommodation for that provision if the Jews had complied.
It's just a question.
It's a question, so I don't know.
It's
Yeah,
a
but
good, it's a
God,
good
I mean,
question, though.
Yeah,
It's-
but with God knowing everything, God knew what was gonna happen, and
Understood.
he still gave us the opportunity, yeah.
He gave them the choice, and they didn't comply.
But I just thought outside the box, so.
Yeah.
Well,
I would say,
That's me.
The Jews
I know I must have-
were put on earth to be the light of the world. So they were supposed to be given a message to all the Gentiles anyway. Okay, and basically everyone would have, it still would have been, I don't know if you would call it the same thing, but other people could have conformed and I guess became people of God with them witnessing everybody, but they were like kind of like keeping everything to themselves, I believe. You wanna,
Yeah. I do, it is in the way God did it, because we see, when we look at the Hall of Faith, right? We see all kinds of people in there,
Yes.
besides Jews. So it's not that he would have left them out, but we would not have been carrying the message as we do today. We carry the message because they did. And the same thing is like we could use with things that God has given us to do individually. You know, when we don't do it, God rise up a people. He rise up another person to get it done. So not that the Gentiles would have been left out of salvation and being saved, but they wouldn't have been the ones leading the torch, carrying the torch, as we are today. Yeah, that's more.
That's,
Yeah, I had no doubt that God would, but it just, you know.
absolutely. It raises the question,
Yeah.
what happens, what happens? But if past was prologue, then we know that they wouldn't have complied, because when we opened the lesson, we said that there 1,500 years had gone by where they had been unfaithful and disobedient, and that ultimately caused God to take them to Babylon. So, go ahead.
I just want to hand this to I only got a few copies of the timelines here. And you know how we use 457.
Yes.
You see the other denominations use between 446 and 445 with a prophecy, the 49 years, and they take the last week and they put that at the end, you know, at the end, in a future event. And I just want to pass, this is, I just got like 3 models
Right.
that use, I just want to pass it out to you
But
guys.
we know for clarification that there's no place in the Bible that says cut off the last 7 weeks of that prophecy and add it to the end time. Okay. So that explains, that story, we go with that, so that explains the 490-year prophecy where we're at. We also understand that since the 490-year prophecy and the 2300-year prophecy started at the same time, that the 2300-year prophecy goes on. Well, 2300 years going forward from 457 BC gets us to 1844. And we understand, you know, what the Adventists believe happened in 1844. You know, we had the date correct, but the event was wrong. We were looking for Christ to come back the second time. But in actuality,
It wasn't the Adventists, it was the Millerites.
the Millerites, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and so what happened was, with further study then, they concluded that, and actually what happened was Christ in heaven in 1844 goes from the holy place in the temple to the most holy place in the temple. And what he then starts at that time is what we call the investigative judgment, which is going on now, where Christ is judging those who are going to be called back with him. And that goes on until he comes back for the second time. So that explains the dates and how 1844 matches up with the 2300-year prophecy, and the 490-year prophecy, again, just tells us to the year when Christ would start his ministry, when his ministry would end, when he would be crucified, and then when salvation would be open to Jew and to Gentile. Okay?
Yes, sir. Appreciate
I
it.
tried to, it's sometimes a little difficult to explain in such a short period of time.
So Christ started his ministry,
In year 483 of that prophecy, which is 27 AD.
okay, that's what I was gonna say, 27.
Right.
You stopped me, when you said 4, I'm like, okay.
I'm sorry.
I got this wrong again. So it is 27.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And what is it that you said in 483 what?
Well, that's the 483rd year of that 490-year prophecy. That's when Christ starts his ministry. So you got to remember that a day is a year, okay? So seven days is 7 years. So the 483rd year of that prophecy, Christ starts his ministry. He's baptized. That's in 27 AD. His ministry goes on for 3.5 years. So he's crucified in 31 AD. And then 3.5 years after that, that ends the 490-year prophecy.
That's too much math for me. I think 27 is perfect.
All right. Like I said, I didn't want to walk off too much in the woods, but I just want to kind of give us, the takeaway is that the 490-year prophecy tells us exactly when Christ will start his ministry and when he will be crucified. It tells us when he's going to be here on earth, okay, to the year. The 2300 year tells us about when the temple in heaven, the sanctuary in heaven will be cleansed, reconsecrated, okay? Because in some of our reading, it says that they thought that the temple here on earth would be reconsecrated or cleansed, but in actuality, that was wrong. It's the sanctuary in heaven, okay? Okay, how you doing? Good to see you. So if we're good with that, then let's move on with our lesson this week. Okay?
Thank you, Dr. Lee.
Absolutely, absolutely. Actually, I had this all written, and I went back I had this written for this week in lesson 4. I got these tabs, and I went back and I was in lesson 3, so I had to come forward and get my thoughts together pretty quickly. All right, so here we are again, facing opposition, okay? And let's start with our memory text, okay? Our memory text is taken from Ezra 5:5. And again, we're looking at facing opposition, and this opposition is coming from the outside to the Jewish community. Anybody have Ezra 5:5? I can read it though. Go ahead.
But the eye of their God was upon the elders of the Jews, so that they could not make them cease till a report could go to Darius. Then a written answer was returned concerning this matter.
Okay, so here the eye of their God was upon the elders of the Jews, so they could not make them cease till a report came to Darius. So we understand that this is a period of time when the construction of the temple has been held up. The Jews are still working on the temple somewhat, but the decree from Darius to reinstate what Cyrus had put in originally in 538, they're still waiting on this. But since the hands of God were on them, they still were not going to stop doing what they were going to do. They were going to wait for the decree, but in the meantime, they were going to continue to work. Thoughts on that? Questions? Good?
Yep.
I have to say this very quickly in 2 minutes. The timing of our study through last quarter and this quarter, I think, has just been, God is impeccable in his timing. And we studied last quarter the least of these, and we had so many examples of the Mexicans and immigrants being mistreated. And here this week, we're talking about facing opposition. And what happened this week? Just generally in the United States, what happened this week? What did we see happen? What happened yesterday? There was a funeral yesterday. Who was buried yesterday? Elijah Cummings was buried, okay? This is a man who was called to serve his community. And talking about facing opposition, when I listened to President Obama and other people speak about his life and what his life meant, it's such a vivid example of someone facing opposition. And I would dare say that the most opposition that he faced in his life was when, at the very end of his life when he was sick, when somebody else took the opportunity to say that where he was from, there was a rat-infested place. Where he was from was a place that was an undesirable place to live. A place where a human being has spent his entire life devoted to helping people. There was no more heart-moving eulogy of someone as when he gave the eulogy to Freddie Gray, who had that rough ride, who was killed by the police in Baltimore. He cried there that day because helping someone, and I'm sure he could see in him the opposition that he had faced in his life. And here at the end, God just kind of gets, you want to look at opposition, you want to put a face on opposition. Let me give you what that looks like here in real time today. Somebody who was charged with doing something, didn't shrink from it, stood up to it, was one of the few people that stood up to what's going on in the world today, and because of that was vilified in a way that he clearly didn't deserve. So I thank God this week because he keeps bringing us these real-time, live examples of we're talking about opposition and facing opposition. Here's a man who gave his life and died. The night he was dying, he was still carrying out his work. He was looking out for other people.
His wife put it so eloquently and so passionately.
Mm-hmm.
When she spoke about it, she she wanted them to hear her, and she told them, do you hear me?
Mhm.
He was a human being. He hurt just like everyone else.
Absolutely. But when
Nobody
you,
saw that pain in him.
but when you talk about putting a face on some things, I think God just brings us stuff real time. It just says, you want a picture of it? Look at this. This is what it looks like. Let's go to Monday. And Monday we're talking about the opposition begins. And again, this week we're in Ezra chapters 4 and 5, Nehemiah chapters 4 and 6, and the prophecy of Haggai chapter 1. Okay?
And we're on Sunday.
Yes, Sunday. I'm sorry. What did I say? Monday?
Yes.
Okay, I'm Monday. Sunday. Excuse me. So in Ezra chapter 4, verse 1 to 5, why do you think the Israelite remnant refused the help of the other people in building the temple? What's significant about that word remnant? What's that mean? Who are we talking about?
God's chosen.
Right. So we understand that there was like 2 or 3 million Jews that were hauled off to Babylon. How many came back? It was just 50,000. Okay. So those were the 50,000 that were really the ardent, true believers. They were coming back. They had a work to do. God was directing it. And so why did that remnant refuse the help of other people to build the temple? And we're in Ezra chapter 4, verse 1 to 5.
Well, in Ezra chapter 4,
Yes.
the very first verse there,
Thank you.
third word,
The second word.
the enemy.
Exactly. So what's that say? Would you accept the help of an enemy to do something? No, because you're probably going to be unsuccessful, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So the answer to that question just came, the enemy. You could say, boom, I stopped, I'm good right there, right?
That's it.
I understand the answer, right?
You can't let the enemies into your house.
Exactly.
Because they will bring destruction.
And exactly. And so the lesson points out the fact that there are some things that are just not consistent. The Jewish believers and their enemies, they were not going to work together to get a job accomplished that God had given them. We understand that God's work and Satan's work, you can't mix them in the house of God. It's just not going to work. So there's some things that you just don't mix. And they knew that they should not help except solicit the help of those enemies who didn't want them to be successful at all. Now we realize that in Ezra chapter 4, we're talking about the building of the temple, okay? Ezra doesn't really come into the book of Ezra until chapter 7. So now we're speaking about the building of the temple and Zerubbabel, who went back with the first set of exiles back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Go ahead, Rita.
And with that, Israelites remnant, they really went through some stuff. So with them coming to the point where they were, God has really taken them through some stuff, then got rid of the ones that really wasn't for him. So they know what an enemy looks like, and what they say and what they're doing. So you know, a lot of times you can come into the mix and people pretend to be your friend and they're really your enemy. God's Israelites remnant, they knew by life experience who their real enemies were.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so then if we go a little bit further, in our second question, it says, what else in these texts show why this refusal was the right thing to do? And then if we go to verse 4 and verse 5, that basically answers that question. You want to finish reading that for us, Brother Stewart?
Yes, sir. Verse 4 reads, then the people around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and make them afraid to go on building. They bribed officials to work against them and frustrate their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, and down to the reign of Darius, king of Persia.
Absolutely. So we see that they frightened them, discouraged them, they tried to bribe people to work against their effort. Okay? Thoughts about that? Any questions about that? So we see here all this opposition that's already starting to set up for building the temple. Okay? Let's go on to Monday. Well, let's go back a second. We got a question at the bottom of Sunday. A pretty thought-provoking question. Think about how easily they could have rationalized accepting this help. How easy would it have been for them to accept the help? Remember, they're being oppressed. You know, it's a difficult time. And now here comes a group of people with the wrong intention, but they're offering their help. So how easy would it have been for them to accept the help? Probably a little bit easier than we thought, right, than we think, right? What you thinking?
I was saying, they probably told me we can get it done a lot faster, you know, you'll have 2 to 3 times the amount of people, you know, to get this done, you know, as they're doing their reception.
Absolutely.
And
So they would have presented the picture, of their help in a way that would have been appeasing to them, making it likely that they would accept it. Uh-huh, in the back, uh-huh.
This reminds me of how when God tells us to do something, that we have to really follow his blueprint, you know, even from a very practical aspect. If we feel impressed to do something in our lives, or, you know, think about the story of Gideon. You know, he was like, God, you know, I have all these men here to help me. What's up? Why can't I use all these people? And they ended up using, I don't remember what it was, 300 or so people to fight this battle. And so I'm just sitting here reflecting on times in my life, and I'm just saying, you know, I have to follow what God says, even if it may not seem practical or sensible to me to follow that route. Just stick with it.
We're gonna dig into that point in just a moment, because you said just a moment ago how we need to follow what God has directed us to do, right? Got a point?
Yes, with that, and so often we turn to each other or man
Mm-hmm.
for a solution to a problem that God has, and we see God third, in a sense.
Exactly, and that's
And it's
exactly,
easy to do that because we try to figure it out ourselves, and we see each other.
uh-huh,
You see, it's easy,
Uh-huh.
that would be the easiest thing, but because of their, how God had brought them out of great tribulations and
Right.
out of Egypt or Babylon,
Right.
then they had a sense of security in God's will.
exactly,
And that's what we have to remember, where God's brought us from,
uh-huh,
to know and to believe that he will see us through that present
absolutely.
distress.
That's a perfect segue into Monday. Go ahead, you want to make a point?
We have to be mindful of what our roles are. I think we, a lot of times, take on things that only God can do, and then sometimes we wait on God to do things that he's already commissioned us to do. So we have to realize what our roles are and what God's role is in it.
Absolutely. And again, Monday's going to point this out about us kind of going away from what God has directed us to do. On Monday, prophets encourage. We'll make a point.
Dr. Reed?
Yes.
If we could finish that, it says, what does 2 Corinthians 6:14 have to say to us in this context?
Mm-hmm.
If you read 2 Corinthians 6:14, and I paraphrase, he said, do not be yoked with unbelievers. You have nothing in common, you know, when it comes to faith and believing in God.
Me and my wife talked about that yesterday when we were discussing the lesson yesterday. Expound on that a little bit then. What's that mean to you?
What does that mean to me?
What's it saying to you?
It says to me, well, when I take in the lesson as a whole, it is saying to me that, you know, God had called me to do a certain thing, so I can't reach out to a people who do not believe in God in an effort for them to help me.
Absolutely, absolutely. Don't be unevenly yoked.
Don't be unequally yoked.
That's correct. Make sure that your role, God's vision for you, is consistent with the other people that you're working with. If it's not, then you need to separate yourself from doing that chore or that assignment, right? Let's go to Monday. Monday, and if somebody would pull up 2 Chronicles 7:14. Somebody pull up that one, and then someone pull up Hebrews 8:10. Okay? Now, huh? It's not on there, that's just added text, it's just going to be for foundation of what we're talking about, okay? So on Monday, it says, why does God send the prophets of Haggai and Zechariah to the Jews? Okay? Someone first pull up, let's first go to Haggai chapter 1, okay? And we're going to read just the first 2 verses of that, just for right now, okay? So the question is, why does God send Haggai and Zechariah to the Jews? Okay? Somebody have Haggai chapter 1, verses 1 and 2.
In the 2nd year of King Darius, on the 1st day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, son of Josadak, the high priest. This is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say, the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house.
Do me a favor, just continue to read through verse 5, okay, please?
Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? Now, this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways.
All right, so here, you know, it's really interesting how when these things, there's a date assigned to these things. So you see here in verse 1, it says, on the 29th day of the second year of King Darius. So that tells us exactly when this is happening. So we know that Darius, his reign started in 521, right? That's when he gave the decree to now go back and refinish the temple. Is that correct? Are we all good with that, right? All right, so now this is 2 years later. This is in 519. 2 years later, so God has moved on the heart of Darius to reinstate the decree that Cyrus wrote. 2 years have gone by. Now what's verse 2 say? This is what the Lord of heaven's army says. The people are saying, the time has not yet come to rebuild the house of the Lord. So, what is that saying? Okay, when God is associated with his people, what's he called? My people. He's doing here, the people.
What scripture are you reading?
Haggai,
Oh, okay, I'm reading.
chapter 1, and we're in verse 2. Okay? Yes. You got it? Okay. So here we see, 2 years later, God has moved Darius to do something. 2 years have gone by, and what are they doing? Now they're standing around saying, this is not the right time to do this.
Right.
Is that the point that we just made a moment ago? When God gives us something, we are supposed to be obedient, right? So 2 years go by, nothing is being done, and now we know that they're building luxurious houses. Well, we know that the temple that Solomon built was built out of what? It was built out of cedar. They had to go to Lebanon to get those big trees, the cedars of Lebanon, right? And so now they've got these cedars here, and what are they doing with that wood instead of building the temple? They're building their own houses. They're building their own homes, and they're building luxurious homes. That's what the text says, right? So you are now, you just basically took my plan, set it aside, you're now taking what I had provided to build the temple with, now you're taking those trees, and now you're taking and building your own luxurious house. Somebody read verse 8. This is what God says.
Go up into the mountains and bring down timber and build my house, so that I may take pleasure in it and be honored, says the Lord.
Absolutely. So now God tells them to do what? Go up there and get the wood. He didn't say anything about cedar, whatever, because really it's not about that for God. What is it about for God? It's about them building a temple where he can reside with them, right? Where he can be with them. It doesn't have to be made out of all this other lavish stuff. That's not the important thing. And so he makes that clear by saying, you go up to the hills to get the temple. So why was it necessary now for God to send Zechariah and Haggai to the Jews? It was necessary because they were not doing what they were supposed to do, right? In the first place, right? They were not. And so now, if we then go to, if you go to Ezra chapter 5, okay, verse 1, okay, Ezra 5, verse 1, someone want to read that for us? We're in Ezra 5, verse 1. Now we know now why God is sending them to the Jews. What does verse 1 through 5 say?
At that time, the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem. They prophesied in the name of the God of Israel who was over them.
We're gonna go through 5, to 5.
All the way to 5?
Yeah, to 5, right.
Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, son of Jehozadak, responded by starting again to rebuild the temple of God in Jerusalem. And the prophets of God were with them and helped them.
Okay, so we see here that the construction, after they were encouraged by Zechariah and Haggai, what then happens? They get back in line and then they start to rebuild the temple, okay? But they had really deviated from what God had wanted for 2 years, okay? And then at that end of that 2-year period, then God says, well, I need somebody to go to the Jews to explain to them what it is that I want. Interestingly enough, the construction starts in 519, and in just 4 years, in 515, the temple is complete. So what's that say about us being obedient to God when He gives us an assignment? Number one, the text tells us that God was with them. Is that correct? That's the first thing. And when God was with us, who can be against us? Exactly. Okay? Any thoughts on that?
You said also Second Chronicles
7:14.
And that's an awesome point to point out because God called us what we are.
Right.
Anytime, every time. I mean, He called us stiff-necked. He said the people, and then in
So read that for us.
He said my people.
That's exactly right.
So 2 Chronicles 7:14 says, if my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land.
So God is identifying my people. Same thing with Hebrews 8, verse 10. Somebody have that real quick? Yeah, go ahead. Chapter 8, verse 10.
For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after these days, said the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds and write them in their hearts, and I will be with them a God, and they shall be my people.
Exactly. So we see how God refers to those people who He's aligned with, that are believers. These people here had kind of had strayed away, and He says, the people, these people,
Right.
these people.
They still was these people.
Exactly. Any thoughts on that?
It's not that they were not His people, they were just acting like they forgot who they were part of. And God trying to, let us know that at any given time, we could be in His will or out His will.
Right.
And
Well,
we acknowledge that.
I think the point is that what the Jews were doing at that time was not consistent with His will.
Exactly.
And so He did not want to
Be associated.
be aligned with that as if
Right.
they were carrying out His will. So that was a way to draw a distinction between the people, these people, versus my people.
Which would give us a understanding that sometimes why people don't want to deal with us when we're in our foolishness or when we're not on one accord with God's will, because He said by their fruits you should know them. And oftentimes we may act in a way or present ourselves in a way that is just ungodly. And if God did it, they say, well, you should still, go and do this. I'm like, no, I don't think so. Because one thing for sure, by beholding, we do become changed. And then it's like people have invited me when I was working, to parties and things like that, the job. And I wouldn't go. And they say, why don't you come? I said, because you're going to get that alcohol in you, and whatever you've been thinking about me all week, you think you got a right to say it. So I just stay away. I see you at work on Monday. So we have to, be wise.
Absolutely, absolutely. Tuesday, we're talking about work stoppage. So here we go from oppression begins, the prophets encourage them to restart the work, and here now we're talking about work stoppage, and we're in Ezra chapter 4, verses 6 to 24. We can't read all those verses. But the question is what did the enemies do in these texts in order to stop the work in Jerusalem? We can pick out a few of the texts that basically answers that question for us. If we go to Ezra 4, start with verse 6. If we have it there, then we can just go through a few of the verses and then we can just answer the question, okay? Anybody want to answer the question before we start? Any ideas about what he did to stop the work?
Yeah, they wrote a letter to Artaxerxes first,
Okay.
saying that the rebuilding of Jerusalem would be a threat to the power at hand.
All right. Well, you saw the text I had outlined. So, and then what else happened?
They wrote accusations, and what actually stopped it was when they told the king that their money would be stopped. They would not pay toll, tribute, custom, and thou shalt endanger the revenue of the king.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So we see here that the enemies of Judah, they wrote a letter of accusation. That's in verse 6. In verse 7, now they send a letter to Artaxerxes, right?
Right.
In verse 13, just what you said, the Jews will refuse to pay. Okay? Verse 15, that's right. That's it.
The other part they wasn't listening to it, but when it came to the money, that made a difference.
Right. In verse 15, it says that this city has a long history of being rebellious. They have a troublesome history of revolting in the past. Okay. And kings and countries, and they revolted against kings and countries who controlled it. Okay. And then we finish out with verse 21. Therefore, issue orders to have these men stop their work. That city must not be rebuilt except by my express command. And in verse 23 it says, then with a show of strength, what happens? The Jews stop working. Okay? So we see here, what did the enemies do? We've just outlined what they did. Why did the Jews stop building? It tells us that in verse 23, right? In verse 23 it says what? Then, at the end of it, it says, when this letter from King Artaxerxes was read to Raham, Shimshai, and their colleagues, they hurried to Jerusalem. Then, with a show of strength, they forced the Jews to stop working. So they were forced to stop working by force. The question is, didn't they know that God wanted them to continue the work? Did they know that? They knew that. Yes, they did know
were
that.
confused also, and they were afraid.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. They were afraid. They were frightened.
Focus on God.
Exactly, and so their focus was taken away. So they did know that God wanted them to continue the work. The question at the bottom says, have you ever experienced something similar, being convinced that God had called you to do something and then harboring doubts when things got hard? Have we ever been placed in that situation?
Yes.
All of us have, right? You got a comment in the back? Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just thinking, so in Bible times, they're writing letters. Now we have comments through Twitter, Instagram, Facebook.
Instant.
And I'm sure in somewhere other, as long as we're alive, we're going to face opposition, whether it's on the job, whether it's in the church. And, I'm just sitting here saying, we have to be true to ourselves, right? We have to, if we really feel that God has called us to do something, we have to stand on our own truth, respectfully as a Christian in love, but we have to just hold our own truth because, and then what I love about God is that he sees when we're getting weak. Mm-hmm. So in this instance, he sent the prophets to encourage because they were afraid. Mm-hmm. We all get afraid. Mm-hmm. We all are in situations that are uncomfortable, but thank God that his grace and mercy endures forever and that he'll send somebody to send an encouraging text message, or he'll have somebody call, or he'll send a class like this where we can really come together and study God's word to keep us grounded. Absolutely. So I'm just thanking God, from a very practical standpoint, that he sends help, he sends encouragement, right. And I'm asking God to help me to be true to myself, no matter what the opposition is.
Exactly, and that was a point that we raised yesterday when we were studying the lesson. These here are big assignments. We can see that these are big assignments. But the question that we were talking about yesterday was, how do we know when God calls us to do something? Well, oftentimes, what my take on that was that oftentimes God gives us real small things to do, like being kind to somebody, like helping someone. All these things, like you're saying, us being true to ourselves and the fact that the Holy Spirit is working in us and he's directing our life and directing our actions. So oftentimes, we're looking for the real big, super big assignment, and that big assignment God may not need us for, but the small things, the everyday things, being kind to people, saying a nice word to someone, helping someone, maybe somebody said something to you that you didn't like, but perhaps in your own actions show that that's not really, you know, what really is going to be the determining factor for you. You're beyond that, and so you behave in a way that shows that you're living your life like a Christian. You're living your life in a Christ-like fashion. So we have a lot of opportunity to do these small things that in the end prepare us for the big things. We understand when we look at Nehemiah. Nehemiah, okay, he had a big job to do here, but what did he do? What did God do to prepare him? Well, he spent 4 months, you know, praying and fasting, you know, so that at the time when the job came to him what to do, he didn't have to fumble around and figure out what he was going to do, what he was going to say, how he was going to approach it. He had already been prepared. And in the same way, these small things that we can do are like preparation for us as well.
And the word tells us that he who's faithful over little will be faithful over much. If you're not faithful over little, why would God trust you with much? So we really have to get there to even be trusted by God to handle those things.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts on that? The small assignments that we have right now that perhaps we don't quite fulfill all the time. Maybe we need to focus on. What you thinking, Tim? Huh? You agree or disagree?
Oh, I agree.
Uh-huh.
But sometimes, even when it's a small assignment, sometimes even the small assignments, you just do it instantly because it just came to you. Those small assignments, you know.
But that's why the word tells us that we give thanks for the small things and the big things. We do nothing on our own. Everything we trust to God. So because the small things make them a little bit easier, again, that's just...
Yeah, but the small assignments are stopped also.
Oh, yeah, sometimes, yeah. Yeah. We're not successful. We're not successful even with the small things, so...
And the opposition can be great. I was in a lawsuit with the federal government. I was in a lawsuit with the VA from 1996 to 2005. And when I first got started, everybody was with me. But when I really got into the thick of things, it was like they took 3 steps back and nobody wanted to be associated with me because they did not want the treatment that I was getting. They didn't want that treatment. Mm-hmm. So opposition is going to come. And so with that opposition coming, you just have to have that faith to know God is going to give you who you need, what you need, when you need it, and you just got to force through, even when you don't want to force through.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's go to Wednesday. The question on Wednesday is now we're looking at Nehemiah, and we're looking at Nehemiah in the year 444, 445 BC, because we know this is when Artaxerxes gave the decree for him to go back and to build the gates and the wall around Jerusalem. And so the question is that what did the Jews do under Nehemiah's leadership to stand up to the opposition? Have we read chapter 4 of Nehemiah? Mm-hmm. So what did he do? What did they do?
They set a watch and was on day and night. And I'm like, I was just picturing that in my mind. How can you be doing bricks on one hand and then holding a weapon in another hand? I mean, that was a feat to do, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. That's what they were doing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. In verse 4 of Nehemiah, okay, if we're open to Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 4 it says, "Then I prayed." So there's a consistent pattern in what Nehemiah does. And what is that pattern?
He prayed over everything.
Right. He stops himself, right? Before he took the chore of going back and rebuilding the city. When he saw the condition of the city, he sat himself down. He wept, he mourned, and then he fasted, and then he prayed. Here in verse 4, what he says is, I prayed. Okay? So he prayed first before doing anything, before stepping on anything on his own, he prayed. Okay? And in verse 9, what's he say again?
We prayed.
But we prayed to our God and guarded the city, we guarded the city day and night to protect ourselves. So this says that what they're doing, they are preparing themselves. They're doing something. They're not just sitting there waiting for God. They knew God was on their side, but they're not waiting for God to show up. By them preparing themselves and standing up, the enemy can see them through those open gates in the wall. So they're looking prepared to them. Is that correct? Okay. So then in verse 13, what's it say he did?
They armed. So I placed armed guards behind the lowest parts of the wall.
Mm-hmm. Right.
In the exposed areas.
Right.
I stationed the people to stand guard by families, armed with swords, spears, and bows.
Okay, so again, they're preparing. And did they have to do anything? Did they have to fight?
No.
No, because what verse 15 says?
When our enemies heard that we knew of their plans and that God had frustrated them, we all returned to our work on the wall.
So because they prepared themselves, they didn't really have to fight. If the enemy had not seen them standing up there in the gates, then it's likely that they would have then had to encounter them in some form of physical altercation. Is that correct? But since they prepared themselves, they did what they were supposed to do. God did what they were supposed to do, and so they never ever had to fight anybody. All right? Do we agree with that? So why was it important for them to prepare themselves to fight rather than just to do nothing, believing that God would protect them? That says something about us today. What should we do today?
Right?
We should pray, but we should also then prepare ourselves. Not just
Yes.
right, just not sit around waiting for something, it's for something to happen. Exactly. You gonna make a point, Brother Stewart?
No, when I read it, I just wrote down, they did their part, and God would do the rest.
Absolutely.
We have to trust God.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Like some people that I hear, often say, oh, don't worry about it, God will take care of it, God will take care of it. But what are you going to do?
But I think that what this shows us that there's a partnership there, right? Us and God. We can't stand back always just waiting for God to do it. There are things that we can do to prepare ourselves, and when we do, then it's perhaps easier for us to see the hand of God working, right? Exactly. Go ahead.
And they just didn't get in a fight mode. They continued the mission of God.
That's exactly right.
Building the-
So what happened? So you got a contingent of people that are in these gates, and so what happens? How many of them are carrying a sword around? Half of them are, and the other half are working.
Yeah.
So Nehemiah is just switching people out. Half are being guards, half are working. So they always are showing a force of protection. But what's happening is that they're continuing the work on the wall.
Right, so
Right.
in making it practical is that even though we have to stand up to issues, don't stop the program. Continue the program, but then have prepare yourself to be open to deal with the opposition that comes.
Mhm.
Don't just throw what God called you to do, turn your back on it. Continue working at it.
Absolutely.
And the whole thing is, one thing, they had unity.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing
Mhm.
that they also had, was unity in that we're gonna finish the task
Mhm.
and we're gonna be ready for the opposition.
Absolutely.
So you just, under
Brother-
God's guidance.
That takes us back a little bit too, when we said the enemies. If you had allowed the enemy to help, this unity would not have been there. That would have been discouragement, that would have been disruption in the plan. So that's another reason too, why you have to keep the enemy out of what God is calling.
That is correct, because several months ago, we were speaking about the concept of disunity. We were speaking about disunity in the church, and we see how destructive that was. Same result was going to be here if they had allowed people who were to come in to help them, that were not really, that their goal wasn't really consistent with what God wanted them to do. If we finish out on Thursday, we're talking about doing a great work. And we're in Nehemiah chapter 6, and it's in verse 3. Nehemiah 6 is basically continued opposition to the rebuilding of the gates and the wall around Jerusalem, okay? And so in verse 1 and 2, we see that there are a lot of people that are engaged in this. If somebody has verse 3, I'll read 1 and 2, then you can read verse 3. But it says, Sanballat, I'm in Nehemiah 6, and we're just going to go 1 to 3 as we finish out. Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem, the Arab, and the rest of our who? Enemies. Found out that I had finished rebuilding the wall and that no gaps remained, though we had not yet set up the doors and the gates. So Sanballat and Geshem sent a message asking me to meet them at one of the villages in the plain of Ono, but I realized they were plotting to harm me. We spoke about this a couple weeks ago, right? How many times did they send for him to have a meeting? About 4 times, right? And he realized that they were going to kill him, right? So in verse 3, what's verse 3 say?
So I sent messengers to them with this reply. I am carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you?
Absolutely. So the question is, why does Nehemiah see this work he is doing in Jerusalem as a great work? Why is it a great work?
Because at the end, he was going to bring glory to God.
Absolutely. So who's directing the project here? It's God. It's God. And he realized that, and he wasn't going to be distracted or dissuaded from the project that God had given him to do. Right? I had a thought about this because it says that Nehemiah had discernment. And that is what gave Nehemiah his focus. He could discern what God wanted him to do. And because he had that discernment, then he was not going to lose focus on finishing the task that God wanted him to do. Okay? One last question.
Brother,
On Thursday, yeah, go ahead.
but also in the lesson, it brought out where they did implant an enemy in the camp. You know, telling him to come to the house to pray about it, when he had already talked to God. And when we know that we have gotten a call from God, you know, go to the temple, and it would have put him out of order of who he was, what his role, you know, in the work of God at that time.
Okay.
And sometimes, you know, people say, well, you have a right to say that and do this and do that because of where you are. But we have to know the role of the organization of God's church, of God's people. And that was just a distraction from within. That's when it started. I know we're going to get into it next week, but it started in this week's lesson that someone from within was being bought to you know, bring him down.
Right, to
discourage him.
Exactly. So we finish out with the question is what else, what were the attempts in this case to stop him? If we look in verse 4 and 5, what did they try to do? We talked about this before, brothers. So what were they going to try to do?
Intimidation,
Right.
bodily harm, and
First-
tried to get him to commit a sin.
That's correct.
That's
Verse
right.
4 and 5, it says that they were going to make an attempt to kill him.
Yeah.
Verse 6 through 8 says that they lied. Okay? Verse 9 through 14 says that, like you said a moment ago, they were intimidating the Jews and trying to intimidate him. And in verses 17 to 19, we find that he bumps upside hypocrisy. Okay? Which is what you said just a moment ago about Tobiah and those people at the end. They were appearing as though they were on his side, but in actuality they weren't. We need to close out in 1 minute. Go ahead.
There was also a point that was brought out of that he went to the house of Shemiah, and he said, let's go to the house of God and pray. And not only was they attempting to kill him, but they were attempting to get him in trouble with God. I mean, he wasn't supposed to be there praying in the temple. And he wasn't supposed to take that person there praying in the temple. So not just they wanted to destroy him, but they wanted to destroy and cause problems between him and his relationship with God.
Absolutely. So we see as we finish out the lesson that the head of the lesson was facing opposition. We see that the opposition that they faced, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the 50,000 Jews, the remnant going back, that opposition was pretty forceful. There was a lot of opposition. That's the outside opposition. Next week, we're going to look at the opposition within the Jewish community. Okay? Let's close out. We're running about 5 or 6 minutes late. Let's close ahead and let's have prayer, okay? God, we just want to thank you again this morning for just an absolute life lesson, how we should stay true to you and stay true to the mission that you have given us, God. We thank you for the study. We thank you for the exchange here in class today. And we thank you, God, for the growth that you continue just to shower upon us. Continue, God, to have us come to the Word. Continue to have us grow. Continue to have us study and learn. We also know from wisdom, knowledge leads to wisdom. So we thank you, Lord, for hearing our prayer. Help us transition into the 11 o'clock service and continue to bless those who are here in your house, those who cannot be here, but those who are on their way. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Amen. We always run out of time.
I don't understand. I was going out of town.
Hey, we got an A on that.
We?
Yeah.
God got an A.